Are you tired of spending too much of your hard-earned money at the supermarket? Are you dreaming of farm fresh eggs, homegrown veggies, and homemade everything? Well, welcome to Ditch the Store, where we break free from supermarket dependence and take back control of our food and household essentials. I'm CJ, and I'm here to show you that life is too short for store-bought eggs. So let's get started. G'day everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ditch the Store. I have to be a little bit quiet today. Handy helper is on night shift at the moment, and any of you that have been shift workers would know how annoying it is to be woken up during the sleep that you get after a night shift. So I'm trying to be super quiet around the house and let him get some really good quality sleep after a 12-hour night shift, which, you know, I did 17 of my 25 years as a shift worker, and I can say that night shifts, as you get older, night shifts just get harder and harder to cope with, and I look very forward to the day when neither of us have to do night shifts, because I don't sleep very well when he's on night shift either. For some reason I go into some reason, 8 years of PTSD treatment, I go into hyper alert mode when he is away from the house. And I think it's because I have that whole thing of not being able to let my guard down. There's not somebody else there to help protect the house. So I have to go into hypervigilant mode when he's not there, which makes for a pretty crappy sleep for me as well. But he's only got a couple of nights of it, and then he's back to normal shifts. So we're still on sourdough for the next couple of weeks, and we are talking about what flours work for sourdough. Now, I want to preface this by saying I'm not a baker, and everything I've learned has pretty much been trial and error. So I've tried flours, gone, that doesn't work. Then I've Googled usually after I've tried it and fucked it up. And then I Google it and go, oh God, what was I doing wrong? So there's so many different flours out there to pick from. And when it comes to making bread, and particularly making sourdough, I just want to say right from the get-go, if you are like me at the moment, I'm on a very tight budget. If you are on a tight budget, don't stress about having to buy the cheapest flour. I have actually seen a study done by a German guy who used this super strong specialty bread flour and, home milled wholemeal flour and this super high protein strong flour. And guess what? The all-purpose flour he used, the cheapest all-purpose flour that he used, which is plain flour for Australians. In Australia, we call it plain or self-raising. I'm not sure what it's called in the States. I know all-purpose is plain flour, but I don't know what you guys call self-raising flour. The cheapest plain flour that he bought was actually the best producer. It was the one that made the best sourdough loaf. So before I go into all this stuff about flours, if you just sit there and go, shit, I can only afford the really cheap plain flour. Only thing I will say, and we'll talk about it later, is don't buy the bleached flour. Bleached flour has so many chemicals in it. If you can only afford unbleached, plain white flour, go with that. Hey, if you're getting started, you're ahead of the game anyway. So what kind of flours are we going to talk about? Before we do, I just want to brush over, for some of you that may not know, and, I didn't really know all this stuff until I realised that both myself and OJ, my son, both have a little bit of a reaction to some glutens. So I learned a bit more about flour then, and that's why we love the sourdough bread, because when I do sourdough bread, and I've just made a loaf, like as in a tin loaf of sourdough this morning for the kids to use for sandwiches. When I do make that sourdough loaf, neither of us have a reaction to it. I also made some cinnamon scrolls out of sourdough, and they're pretty yummy. I've already had 2 of them. I probably shouldn't have had 2 this morning, but I have already had 2. They were my breakfast. It's after lunch now, so, that's fair. But flour. So flour is essentially, it generally comes from wheat, but it can be made from other different grains. But flour is generally a grain that has been ground down and processed to make it powdery and finer so that it can be then produced into something like a bread. And depending on how it's processed and where it comes from, depends on what you're going to get. But When they break the grain down, and we'll assume it's wheat, but it can also be rye, spelt, rice, oats, sorghum, buckwheat. You can have a mix of those kind of flours and grains all together. But when the wheat, we'll say wheat for the ease of it, when wheat is milled, it's broken down into three separate parts. And one is the bran, which is the fibrous outer layer. And you'll see that in wholemeals. You can see the actual fibrous outer layer of the hull. The germ, which is the nutrient-dense centre part of it. And this is why some people who are going back to a traditional ancestral diet will try and incorporate a lot of that wholemeal flour into their diets, because the germ is the nutrient-dense part of it. And then the endosperm, and that's the starchy carbohydrate middle part of the grain. Now, it doesn't contain much nutrients, and that's why flour sometimes can be wiped out of a diet without a problem. Like you technically don't need to eat wheat. Humans can survive quite well eating other things and omitting wheat from their diet. It's just that we like to eat bread, and it's a convenience food. It's a food that you can slap some meat or some eggs on and eat it as a sandwich, and that makes it very convenient to carry with you and eat, in that format. And that's why that's how breads have developed over the years, is the fact that it's convenient. So when you look at the flours that you'll get, when you see flours that don't have any kind of hull or anything fibrous in it, generally that is a flour that's just the endosperm. The bran and the germ haven't been added back into the flour. When you see wholemeals or rye or spelt, sometimes you'll see grainy bits in there. And essentially what they've done is when they've processed it, milled it down, they've then added some of the bran or some of the germ back into the flour to give it that fibrous texture and to give it, a bit more texture, essentially. And that's the nutrient-dense part. So your wholemeal bran, your rye flours are going to be more nutritious than a plain, very filtered white flour. And when I say white, I don't mean bleached, I mean unbleached. And there is a difference. So when you buy wholemeal or whole wheat flour, those three parts are still there. They don't always put all of the bran or the germ back into the flour, but they will put some of it back in. If you're getting white flour, you're basically just getting endosperm, which, as I said, is not the nutrient-dense part of the grain. And it depends what you're looking for. I mean, kids tend to like to eat white bread. I know growing up, we were always told, eat brown bread, it's better for you, which probably is true if it is home ground wheat that is being produced into bread. Then it probably is more nutritious, even though, for years I was like, how can it be more nutritious? It's exactly the same thing. It's not. The more research I've done on it, the more I realise that having those extra bits in there are good for you. Now, there's two different ways that they can mill it too. And one is you'll see stone ground flour on the packet that you're buying. And that essentially means that it hasn't been ground by a mechanical machine, like a highly processed kind of machine that's really pushing things out. And the stone ground process is between a couple of large stones, and it's ground, and the tests show that there's more nutrients and more natural oils that are retained inside the flour. So you'll often see it classified as organic or artisan flours because it's been stone ground, which is a more expensive process to do, and that's why you pay a bit more for it. As I said at the beginning, if your budget does not dictate that you can have stone ground flour, do not stress about that. I buy bulk, large packets of flour because I am on a budget, and I get that everybody has a budget. It just depends how high that budget is. But if you're on a low budget like me, where you don't want to spend any more at the supermarket, then unbleached white flour is fine. It will still get you the bread, okay? As long as your diet is nutrient dense in the meat that you're eating eggs, you're eating good amount of butter and those good animal fats for your brain health, you will be fine eating white bread. Don't tell Dr. Chafee that I said that, because he will say you don't need bread, you only need meat. Now, roller milled flour, which is what our commercial flours are, it's just a process that is what's cheaper to start with. It's more efficient in grinding it down to that really highly processed flour. and it uses steel rollers to separate all the parts of the grain. So the endosperm, the germ, and the what's it called? Brain blank. I'm still getting over my flu at the moment. The bran, the germ, and the endosperm. It separates all of those out. And when it separates all of those out, that's when you get that highly processed commercial white flour. And that's fine. And believe me, it is fine for your starter and it is fine for making bread. You don't need to stress about, I can't afford the really, nutrient dense. I can't afford the wholemeal flour. I can't afford rye. I can't afford stone ground. Don't stress about that. The stuff that I buy from Costco is just as good for making bread. It's not going to be as nutrient dense, but yeah, at the end of the day, like I say, if your diet is sufficient in other things, you will be fine. Now, what you can do, if you can afford, if your budget will stretch to it, what you can do is with your starters, you can do a mix. So you can do half of an expensive flour with half of the plain flour, to allow yourself to be able to get a bit more nutrient into it and get your starter a bit more fired up, because we'll talk about it in a bit, but some flours do a better starter than plain flour. So you can go half and half on the mix, just 50, like if you're doing 50 grams, do 25 grams of one, 25 grams of the other, put in your starter, and it will give it a bit of a boost and make it a bit more active and a bit more responsive. So bleached or unbleached flour. I won't buy bleached flour at all, and it is a personal choice, so I'm not going to say you don't buy it, but you will not get as good a starter from it. And the reason for that is that it contains, and I have to read it because I can never remember the chemical names, benzoyl peroxide and chlorine dioxide is what they use, one of those two chemicals, to bleach the flour. And when they do that, they kill off a whole bunch of bacteria and microbiomes and things like that that are in the flour that are actually good for the starter process. So I would say avoid the bleached if you can. Again, if your budget does not stretch to it and the bleached is cheap, go for it. Just accept the fact that your starter may not be as active because it's not going to have as much good bacteria in it to make it grow and make it active. And your bread's probably not going to be as good as if you were just using unbleached flour. So generally the unbleached and bleached flours are around the same price anyway, especially if you're buying it in bulk. So I would always go for the unbleached where possible. Bleached flour, it does soften up the gluten in it, having those chemicals in it. And that's my understanding, is that's where you don't get that stronger bread. It kind of gets a bit floppy and a bit ordinary, and you don't get a real good dense bread like bubbles and strong bread where it's kind of attached together. Whereas unbleached flour is allowed to age over time, and it has an off-white appearance, but it's definitely, and it's better in flavour too, is what the experts say. But unbleached flour tastes better than bleached flour, which doesn't surprise me. I've heard horror stories of them bleaching chicken carcasses in big chicken factories, and the only reason they do it is, again, it's like the raw milk issue. If you're feeding the masses, you have to think about food safety and hygiene. And if you are dipping 100 carcasses into the same tank of water to clean them and wash them after you've plucked and gutted them, they put bleach in the tanks so that when the 100th chook comes through that water, which has already washed 99 chooks before it, it's not going to have any bacteria still attached to the carcass when it comes out the other side. If you were just washing 100 chicken carcasses in the same water, it would be vile. It would be like fecal soup by the end of it. So they bleach them. They put bleach in the water in order to keep that process clean. Now, as I said, when they're feeding the masses, these are the things they have to do. That's why I tell you to grow your chooks at home. And don't forget, you can go and buy my book about raising chickens for meat. It's on Amazon, so I'll put the link in the show notes as usual. But yeah, definitely anything with bleach in it it's going to have chemicals in it. It's not going to be as nice. So an unbleached flour is definitely the option if you can. If that's all you can get, great, use it. You're still doing well. And the reason that the bleached flour doesn't work also is because the wild yeast in the it will make a starter, but it just won't do it as well. The wild yeast and bacteria that are in flours get bleached out. Like they literally get killed off with the bleaching process. And so you don't end up with that really kind of super vibrant wild yeast growing, and like it doesn't ferment the way that it's meant to. So yeah, that's my thing. Always choose the unbleached if you have a choice for sourdough. And especially if you are on a budget and that's all you can stretch to, don't panic. That you're doing great. Now I want to talk about the different flours. Just this might be a little short episode, this one, because there's not a lot to go through. And I haven't tested. I know last week I said I was going to try and test some gluten-free flours. I have not got to it. I'm on a super, super budget this week, and it just was not going to happen. If anything, I might get some white rice out and grind it up in my Thermomix and use that as flour and see how I go. But that's about as good as it's going to get. So rye flours. Rye is traditionally what was used for a lot of artisan breads, things like that. And that's because it ferments really fast. So you get a really good starter out of it. If you start your starter with a half rye, half plain, it will get active really quickly. So you'll get a lot more wild yeast, you'll get a lot more good bacteria in it, and it will bubble and fizz a lot quicker. It does get a really earthy smell to it when you do it up, and that's fine. You know, if that's what you like, then that's fine. Again, as I said, if you can't afford rye flour, don't stress. It is a bit dearer, so yeah. But it is very good for starting a new sourdough starter. It's also good if you have a sourdough starter that seems to be a bit sluggish and doesn't seem to be picking up, then just going and buying like a 1 kilo bag of rye and using, you know, half and half plain of rye into your starter to try and get it a bit more active can be a really good tip for using it. Just save it for that. Don't use it for everything. Just use it for that. Now, some people will ask too, if I do half rye, half plain flour, can I still just use plain flour for my bread? Yeah, absolutely. So long as your starter is active, it doesn't really matter what bread you're putting it into. What I would say is don't go 100% rye in your starter and then mix it with plain flour. Go 50-50, just because you might end up with a little bit of culture shock. It might just get in there and go, oh, this is not the same micro bacteria that I'm used to. This is not the same fermentation process that I'm used to. And it might freak out a little bit. Excuse me. So wholemeal, whole wheat flour. Again, super, super great for fermenting. It's another one that if you've got some and you have a sourdough starter that's not super active and not really bubbly, putting some wholemeal or whole wheat flour in there can make a real difference to it and give it a really good boost. It will speed up the fermentation process, so you do have to watch a little bit. I was probably a couple of years ago when I was first learning about it, I was watching a German guy who's right into his bread making, and he did a test with all different flours. And he was the one that did the test with the standard plain flour, and it made a beautiful loaf of bread. He did it with freshly ground whole wheat flour, and the fermentation, he tried to do it a 4-hour bulk ferment for all of the breads that he was trialing it, doing a bit of an experiment. And the whole wheat, he should have only done the bulk rice for about 2 hours. It fermented and rose really quickly, and he ended up overproofing his bread, and then by the time he got it out of the oven, it looked a bit flat. It was still quite edible, but like he said, it didn't work out how he wanted it to. And I think he did a second test on it and did the shorter ferment on it, shorter bulk rice, and it worked better. So it does ferment and rise really quickly, so you have to watch it, and whatever your recipe is for plain flour, just keep a closer eye on it if you're using whole wheat, because it will rise a lot quicker. Now, it is super high in nutrients, and because it's got the bran and the, and a germ, it's got those added it back into it, so it is much more nutrient dense than your standard plain flour. And because of that, it will have a different taste to it. It'll still have your sourdough bread taste that you like, but it'll have probably a bit more of a nutty taste, a bit more of a grainy taste, earthy taste. So if you don't really like that, or if you're making loaves for kids and you think they're going to be a bit fussy, stick with the plain flour. And it's best for getting your starter going really fast. So putting half plain, half wholemeal in to get your starter, it will give it a whole different kind of microbiome and really get that wild yeast pumping. And it adds a different taste to your loaf. So that's good for that. Unbleached white flour. What I use, 90% of what I use is unbleached white flour. It is super easy for beginners. So I would always say start with unbleached white flour. It's very forgiving. It gives a good gluten structure, so the dough can get quite stretchy and strong, and that's what you want when you're doing your folds, which we'll talk about next week. When you're folding your loaf over to give it a real good, to kind of trigger that gluten reaction, it gets a real good strength to it. So it makes a good high-rise kind of loaf. It's very easy for beginners. It's very forgiving. You can't really fuck it up too badly. And it has a very mild flavour. So you still get that sourdough flavour, but it won't be over the top earthy or, grainy kind of flavour to it. And it'll be better for people who are fussy eaters. It's great for maintenance feeding because it's cheapest. So you can keep your starter going with very little cost. And it's good for lighter textured loaves. So the other flours tend to make a slightly denser loaf, whereas the white flour will always give you that lighter, more like a sandwich loaf. So good, again, like I said, for fussy eaters. Spelt. Now, I've only used this once, and I do like it, but it's very expensive. And me being the tight-ass budget person that I am, I just don't usually stretch the budget to buying spelt flour. But it gives a nutty taste to it, and it is an older style grain, so it can be a little bit more temperamental with working with it. It does have less gluten in it, which is great for people who have a gluten issue. If money's no object and gluten is a real issue for you, I would say once you've got your starter up and going, try spelt. And even if you went half white, half spelt, just till you get the hang of it, because I always say to people, start with white flour when you're first learning, because it is so forgiving. But if you wanted to throw in half spelt, half white flour, that would reduce the gluten content of your loaf massively. But you'd still get that structure. You'd still be able to form up a nice loaf. So it can be really good for things that don't need the structure like bread. So things like muffins, my cinnamon scrolls, they're all packed in tight, so it didn't really need a lot of structure. Pancakes, flatbreads, things like that. It can be good for those. And in my notes I've got here, good for blending. So it's good to do a half spelt, half white, and that can work too. Now, the gluten-free flours, like I said, I have used buckwheat. I've made a buckwheat loaf before, and it was not great. It was a lot trickier to try and get some kind of structure to the loaf and make it sit up a bit higher. But I'm going to have a crack at rice. I'm going to grind some rice in the thermo because I can blend it in there and make it really powdery. And I'll have a crack at making it and see how I go. I don't know whether I like rice bread or not. I tend not to eat, since I did the carnivore thing, I tend not to eat a lot of rice. When we do have rice, it's usually if we're having some kind of Chinese meat dish, then I'll chuck some rice in sometimes. Or the kids quite often will have chili con carne. And if they have chili con carne, I usually just have a salad with my mince, and they'll have rice with their mince. So it can be used for starters. You can get a starter going on it because it does have the ability to still form that wild yeast and bacteria. But it's a bit more unpredictable with the no gluten in it. You just don't get the strength to it. And you'll probably find that you may need to feed it a bit more frequently. So instead of doing a once a day feed or once every other day feed, you may need to feed it every 12 hours to get it really active. Great for people avoiding gluten. Great for flatbreads because it doesn't have to have that structure like to make the high loaf. And it's good for experimenting. If you've got the time and you want to experiment, I would say go for it. And if you do, please link me in whatever social medias you're on. Post a picture of what you made with it, with one of the gluten-free flours. So buckwheat or rice flours or potato flours or things like that. Post a photo and link me in because I'd love to see it. I like that kind of experimentation. At the moment, the budget is not stretching to it, but like I say, I'll have a crack with some flour that I can mill at home. So we'll see how we go there. Now, why does the flour type actually matter? So there's a couple of things that you need to take into account, and it will depend on your personal circumstances. If you're a stay-at-home mum or you work from home and you are able to, stop doing your work and go to the kitchen and, do a fold with some bread or to, feed a starter or things like that, then experiment away and go for it. If you're very time poor, I would say stick to the white flours. The unbleached white flours, obviously. I would say stick to that and stick to a schedule. Write out a schedule, whether you feed in the afternoon, in the evening, make your dough up in the morning, let it sit all day kind of thing. Then what I normally do, because we're off grid, and I've got some news on that. I'll tell you at the end. Because we're off grid, I tended not to put the oven on late in the afternoon. I would always do it in the morning. So if I was at home, what I would do is I'd put the dough in the fridge overnight to slow that bulk rise after I'd shaped it, and then first thing in the morning, I would put it in the oven to cook. So depending on your personal circumstances, the things that you want to look at for the flours are fermentation speed. So whole grains and rye are obviously quicker. But if you don't mind having a little bit of extra time that you need, then definitely bleached white is the way to go. Flavour profile. Like I said, some fussy eaters might find rye and things like that a bit too strong for them. And especially if you've been used to commercial bread for a long time, or kids have been used to commercial bread, slotting them straight over to a really heavy, dense, grainy sourdough might be a bit much first up. So maybe take it easier and go with the white unbleached to start with, just to kind of slide them into it. And once they get a sourdough taste happening, then, my kids, they're like, oh, that bread tastes really bland if they eat commercial bread now, because sourdough tastes nice. So they like it. Hydration levels. Now, this is something I worked out with using baker's flour versus just all-purpose flour. Sometimes you mix it in and you go, that's so dry. Certain flours will just soak up all the moisture. And if you've got a big bag of flour, trial and error is the best way to go. And this is why I say you get a feel for it after a time. Mix your liquids together and then put your flour in, mix it. And sometimes squeezing the flour through with your hands will help get that moisture content all the way through all the flour. And then wait and see, because if you've got a sloppy loaf, if it's wet, you need to add a little bit more flour. Likewise, sometimes you can end up with a really dry loaf, and just sprinkling a little bit of water over the top of it can be good for when you're doing your process of letting it have its rise and doing the proofing process. Having a little bit extra moisture in there is not going to be a bad thing. But you have to get used to the flour that you're using. And when you change flours, you have to adjust, because the denser and more fibrous kind of flours will soak up more moisture. So you may have to adjust your recipe a little bit to get more moisture in there. And the nutrient content, obviously, is the big one. So, if you can afford whole wheat, if you can afford rye flours, go for it. If you can afford spelt, go for it, because you will end up with a more nutrient dense loaf of bread. But like I said, if your rest of your diet's fine and all you can afford is unbleached white, go to town. You're still miles ahead of other people who are just buying commercial loaves of bread every day. You're still going to be miles ahead of them. So, and on top of that, one of the things I will say is that the age of the flour. So I've got a 25 kilo bag I'm using at the moment. If that was sitting there, if I had that in a container and it was sitting there for 6 months, 12 months, whatever, as it gets older, it will also change in its properties on how it develops the bread. The weather has a big effect on it. So at the moment, leading up to when we started lighting the fire, because we have the fire going full time now, leading up to when we had the fire going, I could not get bread to rise. It was so cold in here. Even though it wasn't cold, the house was cold because there was no fire lit and it was a bit cooler outside. Now I've got the fire going all the time. I'm almost racing the clock to get my bread done, because it just seems to want to rise so quick and the starter just takes off and goes like crazy. So depending on the weather conditions where you are, if you're in a tropical area, you may have to manage it by proofing in the fridge to try and drop that temperature down. Storing your flour, making sure that you've got it in airtight storage before you use it so that it doesn't get stale, because that can affect it. And obviously the texture of it. So depending on how it was milled, if it's commercially milled, then you can treat it normally. If it's not commercially milled, then you may have to look at different things like moisture levels and stuff like that. Now, one thing I will say is try and stick to one flour to start with. Learn how your starter's going to respond and how your bread's going to respond with the one flour first. Then once you feel confident and you've got that going really well, then I would say move on to trialing different ones. Don't just jump in and try and start trialing all of them in one go, because you'll probably overwhelm yourself and get a bit stuck and go, oh, this isn't working. And that's not the idea. Start basic unless you're one of those people that's just always keen to jump right in, I would say start basic. I don't want you to get to a point where you're trying to battle all these technical things and still learning how to do sourdough. You want to start slow, start easy, make it easy on yourself. We already have enough on our plates, most of us. So start easy and just gradually work your way up. Once you're making a good white loaf without any problems, then muck around with spelt, then muck around with the whole wheat, and try different things then. But try and master the basics first before you go jumping into different flours and different things. And like I said, if you can afford to and you're just starting your starter, a little bit of rye flour, a little bit of wholemeal, whole wheat flour can make it, give it a jump start to get your starter really going. And if you're trying to do it on a budget and you wanted to still do that, go half and half rye, half white, mix it together, end of the starter. Now, for the money savers out there, because, the whole point is that we're not spending any more at the supermarket than we have to. And I am the budget queen. So I get 25 kilogram sacks of, I think it is baker's flour. And if they sold plain flour in 25 kilo packs, I'd probably buy it. But I think the biggest one they do with plain flour is 10 kilos, but still cheaper again than what you would get in the supermarket. 25 kilo bag of baker's flour from Costco is $24.99 at the moment. So I use about 500 grams for one loaf when you incorporate the starter flour and things like that. So it's about 50 cents a loaf it's costing me to make a loaf of bread. That's pretty cheap. When I think I was saying a couple of weeks ago, I said, I can't get bread under $3. I can get bread for about $2.50, but that's the cheapest, nastiest, and it's full of chemicals. Like, I went in and had a look at the back of the labels, and I'm mortified that occasionally I do buy, because I'm not perfect like anybody else. Occasionally I do buy a loaf of commercial bread for the kids, especially if we're having people over and we're making sandwiches for a bunch of kids. It's easier sometimes to just do the commercial loaf. And when I looked at the back of the ingredients, I was like, shoot, I don't want to feed the kids that. So $2.50 for a commercial loaf, and it's full of chemicals, versus 50 cents for a sourdough loaf, and it's flour, water, salt. That's it. That's all that's in it. And you can make a whole bunch of other stuff with sourdough starter. Like once you get the hang of it, like I made cinnamon scrolls this morning. The kids are going to love those. They love cinnamon scrolls. I was going to have a crack tomorrow at making focaccia bread. Probably won't be tomorrow actually, because I just remembered I am finally getting all my hair cut off. I've got quite long hair, everybody, and I about once every 3 or 4 years I go and get it chopped really, really short and then let it grow again. And it frustrates me. I alternate between hating long hair and loving long hair. So it won't be tomorrow, it'll be Thursday probably, because I'm recording this Tuesday. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff you can make. I make muffins, crumpets, to drizzle honey over out of my sourdough discard. So yeah, I'm going to start publishing some recipes and just trial and error everything. If it doesn't work, throw it out and start again. It's the amount that you're spending on it is worth the trial and error, because when you get it, you think about if you can make a sourdough loaf of bread for 50 cents versus what do they sell for in the shops at the moment? Like at a baker's, you'd be looking at, you probably wouldn't get out of under $10 for a proper loaf of sourdough. And if you can do it for 50 cents, $9.50 in your pocket is far better than $9.50 in their pocket. And as I said, don't be scared just to use the unbleached white to start with. If that's all you've got, if that's all your budget will allow for, then go with that. Now, for those that are really, really on a budget, or perhaps if you're living in an apartment or a townhouse and you don't have a lot of space to store bulk dry goods, what I would say to you is try and find a friend who's also interested in doing sourdough. Get the tubs that you can get. Just get decor tubs, or I actually bought food grade plastic tubs from Bunnings that I store my salt and flour in, because I buy them in big bulk bags. Now, what you can do is buy a 25 kilo bag and split it in half with a neighbour. So you end up with 12.5 kilos, they end up with 12.5 kilos, and you still got it for the $1 a kilo price, which, how can you knock that? And I'm sure that your friend would be grateful if you could do that as well. It's the same with the Costco memberships. Team up with a friend, put down the one address, and both of you have a Costco card as a family membership. They don't care if it's two girls, two blokes. They don't care. Like they're in this day and age, nobody gives a shit about that stuff. So I shouldn't say that. To all my lovely same-sex couples out there, I love you guys. I've got a sister-in-law who's a same-sex couple. What I mean is that nobody's going to question it. And whether you are in a same-sex relationship or whether you're just utilising a friend to make it that you've got a family membership, go ahead and do it. Nobody's going to judge you. I wouldn't judge you. I don't think any normal person would judge you on that one. But if it means you can split bulk dry goods between two households, brilliant. Go for it. All right. So please don't panic about different flours. There are a lot of choices that you have out there, but I would say to you, start basic. Get the basic bitch level to start with, and then build up to the more fancy and more difficult and more technical kind of flours. Just get out there and get a loaf kind of cracking. Is the main thing. But by now you should have your starter going. I've given you all your information for your starter. Get the starter going. I know I've got a couple of friends. Christopher, if you're listening, I went to school with him and he's listening at the moment, and he's just sent me a message the other day saying the biggest argument in their house at the moment is what to call their sourdough starter. Like as far as names go, whatever the name you pick, I'd let the kids pick it because then they'll get more involved with it. But it can be a bit of a debate. I mean, I just said Harry straight up and everybody in the house kind of went, oh, okay, Harry will do. But everybody get your starter going. Next week, we're going to talk about the actual process of making a loaf of bread, because people think that sourdough is so hard, and it's actually not. It's time consuming. It's not a quick loaf to make, but you can just set up a little schedule and go, right, in the morning I'm doing this, in the afternoon I'm doing this, and then the next morning I'm doing this. We'll go through it all. Anyway, don't forget to tag me into your pictures if you have got sourdough starter going. Don't forget to tag me into your pictures if you've made yourself a loaf of bread. I also have the 2-week starter tracker that is online, so don't forget to go and get that. It's at mojohomestead.net / I always get that wrong, but I'm sure it's / sourdough starter. And it's like a 12-day checklist for how your starter's going, and that you're refreshing it regularly and that kind of thing. And go and have a look at that. Now, I am in the process of making a book, like a journal. So like my from breeder to plate for growing chickens for meat production. I'm making journals for goat keeping, beekeeping, chicken keeping, and I'm going to do up one for sourdough, because at the moment I use a boring old notepad book that I write all my stuff in, that's just sourdough trials. I use that to write everything down in, and it's frustrating. So I'm making a proper journal, and I'm going to sell it on Amazon, on KDP, Kindle, and where you can write down the flours that you've tried and write down your starter information, write down the best recipes that you've come up with for sourdough. So you can keep it all in one place, in one handy little book, keep it in the kitchen. So I'm in the process of doing that at the moment. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention was super exciting news here at Mojo Homestead. We have been off-grid for the last 4 years, completely off-grid. So we have our own sewage setup that we use. We have water from water tanks and dams for the animals. And we have lead-acid batteries that produce, off solar panels that produce all the power in the house. Now, the lead-acid batteries, we were buying cheap, I hate to say it, cheap Chinese ones. But that's because that's where they're all made. Anybody that tells you it's an Australian-made one, they're full of shit. They all get imported in from China. You can go and have a look and actually look at their import list and see that they're bringing them in from China. But not all batteries are created equal. Just like not all flowers are created equal. We're living in animal farm at the moment. All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. Well, some batteries are too. So we finally gave up on the lead-acid batteries, and we have got into a little bit of debt to purchase 4 lithium batteries. Now, the 4 lithium batteries that we bought, we'd done our research on them, and I know that some people have some issues with lithium batteries, but we did do our research, and what we realised was that 4 lithium batteries, 300 amp hours, so 300 hours worth of cycling, what we worked out with them was that we will probably never have to turn the power off and never have a problem with the power running out. And with the lead acid batteries, particularly the cheap ones, the power kept running out. We've had the lithium batteries for 4 days and it has not dropped at all. So our power sits between 50, gets up to about 55 on a sunny day, 55, all the way down to when it gets to like 44, the batteries start beeping because it's less than 12 volts going into the power system. And that means we have to turn all our power off. So we have to turn everything off and not open the fridge door kind of thing for 12 hours and wait for the sun to come back up. Since we've had the lithium, they haven't dropped below 50. They've stayed on 51 the entire time. Day, night, doesn't matter. We haven't had to turn the power off. I've been running the oven of a night with no sun on the panels and it's not even putting a dent in it. So for anybody that was humming and hawing about lead acid versus lithium, I know people freak out and go, oh, lithium batteries catch fire. Not if they're kept in a house. So the car ones, there might be some issues with, and I'm not fully across the car batteries, so I'll leave that to the experts. But certainly the house ones, they're not getting moved around. They're not being exposed to extreme kind of weather conditions. They are amazing. I wish we had done this 3 years ago now, instead of just buying cheap lead acid batteries, which, we recycle them, and the metal recycler guy gives us a really good, value back on them. But we just kept having failures. They just kept not charging properly. And I think it was just cheap components in them. These lithium ones, they weren't cheap. They weren't super dear. They weren't as dear as they could have been. But since we've had them, it's been a godsend. So if you're thinking about humming and hawing about it, go do the research on them. You might be pleasantly surprised. Certainly I was. We won't go back from lithium now that we've got them. It's just been amazing. Anyway, that is it for me this week. I am going to go and see how my loaf has done. It's cooled out of the oven, so I might, for those watching on YouTube, I might just put a little picture up of my loaf that I made today and my cinnamon scrolls. And otherwise, I will see you all next week where we will run through the actual process of timings for how to make a loaf of sourdough bread. Anyway, bye for now. Well, that's it for today's episode of Ditch the Store. If you're loving the journey to self-sufficiency, be sure to subscribe. You can also leave a review for us or share this episode with a friend who's ready to break up with their supermarket. If you've got questions or success stories, we'd love to hear about them on the socials. You can also find me at www.mojohomestead.net. Until next time, keep raising, growing and making. And remember, life's too short for store-bought eggs.